In this video, we're going to introduce the configuration of emissions against infrastructure. So we do this at the organization level. You can see I am sat in the people and systems model for my organization. I'm using the demo org, and so you will be able to connect to that organization and follow along and use this as an example to configure the infrastructure in your own organization. The first thing we have to do is define the infrastructure. So as an example, here is our laptop. This is the device that's being used, and we connect it to the systems that the laptop enables. And we do that by dragging an edge out of the laptop and then connecting it to the relevant system. And you can see here in the model, we have done that for a number of systems that we've captured in our models. So once I have that infrastructure created and connected, I can now look at defining its emissions. And there are two stages to doing this. So we come down in the properties panel, we can see we've got a section here for carbon. The first thing I have to do is to create my emission factor. If someone has kindly done this for you already, because these are held at the organization level, you can access emission factors that other people have configured. If you're doing this for the first time, you would need to add your emission factor. So this simple dialog lets you pick from the type of emission factor that you are creating and define what the emission factor is. So as an example, we might take a power emission factor, and what this dialog does is really set the units for the emission. So power emission is reported on kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. As another example, a transport emission is done on kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton per kilometre. So these are numbers that you will need to find. You typically go to an authoritative source within your country in order to understand what those emission factors are. You can define them here. You also need to pick which scope your emission is associated with: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 being a direct emission where I'm putting fuel into something that is being burnt. So an example would be diesel into a generator. A scope 2 emission is a direct emission where the emission is created away from where you are consuming the energy. So the example is I plug my laptop into a power source. The emission is actually occurring at the power station, not where I'm consuming the electricity. And a scope 3 emission is an indirect emission. So that's something that's been created through the supply chain. This has been typically very difficult to define, and it accounts for things like the manufacture and the transportation of assets that you then use. So you need to know these things before you can correctly define this emission factor. So we're giving it a name, a description, we're picking its type, we're choosing the scope, and then we have to find this important emission factor number, which, as I say, comes from an authoritative source. Once you have these defined, you can consume them in different types of emission. So for our laptop, the first one that we have defined is a scope 2 emission. We've used the scope 2 emission factor. So if I just show you what that looks like, if I edit it, it's a power emission, it's scope 2, and it's 0.074 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour, which is the emission factor for electricity produced in New Zealand. I then say I am using this against the laptop. I've specified the number of units that I have inside my organization. I'm picking the kilowatt hour power consumption of my laptop, and I'm choosing the rate. So we have, again, a number of units here that we can use. We're time-based inside LINQ, so the time-based units are the best ones to use. So this is a 0.6 kilowatt hour per hour laptop. We have 9 of them. We know what the emission factors are per kilowatt hour. LINQ now calculates the annual emission in kilos of CO2 equivalent for that infrastructure. We built this in a pizza menu style where you can just keep adding layers of emission to infrastructure. And this is how we've dealt with scope 3 emissions. So as I said, scope 3 is the indirect emission, typically through the supply chain. So we have a manufacturing emission and we have a transportation emission. In order to configure these, we've created different emission factors. So my emission factor for manufacturing is based on a unit, and it's the amount of CO2 equivalent per unit that's produced. This number has come from the laptop manufacturer. So a typical laptop is about 132 kilos of CO2 per unit. So we are allocating this to each unit that we have inside the organization. And as you've seen, we have 9 of those. So this creates a scope 3 emission for us. And we want to know what that looks like per year. So LINQ will calculate that out based on each unit and then the number of units. And you can see the totals in the dialog. The other scope 3 emission that we've configured is the transportation. So I've created this transportation emission factor where we know the kilogram CO2 equivalent per ton per kilometre for the type of transportation that has been used to deliver the asset. In this case, we have used an emission factor for a large container ship. This is a number that has come from the Ministry for the Environment. And as for other emission factors, you would need to go and find an authoritative source to get this number. Once you have the number, you can use it in another scope 3 emission. So this is transportation. It requires us to look at the distance traveled, the weight of the unit, and then pick our rate per unit per year. We have now created a emission profile for that asset. And so we can report this at several levels. You get a properties panel inside the people and systems view, and you get the totals for each of the scopes that you've defined across the infrastructure that you've connected. You can also go to the insights panel, and under charts, you could pick a system, and from a bar chart, pick carbon, and now you get a carbon profile view of each system through your organization. If you hover over the bars, you get to see which emission you have been considering. Within a single model, go to new customer accounts. Inside the insights here for charts, I can now pick action and get a carbon profile per action. So I can now identify which action in this particular part of the organization is creating the most emission. And that might become a focus of how might we change the way that we do that piece of work in order to minimize the emission. And I can also look at systems, again, within the model. So previously we looked at it at an organization level. We're now looking at it from a particular model within the organization. So quick recap. This is managed from the people and systems model, where we define our infrastructure, we connect our infrastructure to systems, and then we come and define the emission profile for that infrastructure. We have an emissions calculator for you where you can create the emission factors and then you can consume those against your infrastructure. LINQ handles the allocation of the emission through the relationships that we're defining here from a capacity and a cost perspective, and then within each model from a consumption perspective. As ever, we're very happy to have a conversation about this and support you as you want to configure emissions against your own infrastructure in your organization. Please get in touch if you need any help.